Welcome to our Coaching Focus podcast. I'm joined today by Ian Dinwiddy. Ian specialises in helping new dads navigate the complexity of modern fatherhood. And today's topic is how to be a great dad without sacrificing a great career. Ian's married to Lisa and spent many years combining work with being a primary carer to his children, who are now 13 and 11, including 2 stints as a full-time stay-at-home dad. Outside of work, Ian umpires at the highest levels of domestic field hockey in England, referees his son's football matches, and manages his daughter's junior club hockey team. Welcome, Ian. It's a real pleasure to have you as our guest.
Thank you very much for having me, Trayton. It's a pleasure to be here and an important topic, and look forward to getting into the detail with you.
Yeah, for me, it's a fascinating topic. I'm a dad myself, so I'm sure like our listeners are. I'm going to get a lot out of this conversation. So really looking forward to it. To get us started, what I'd really like to ask, which is a curious sort of question that emerged to the surface for me, is what makes a great dad?
I think it's such an amazing question. It's so personal as well. So when I sort of encapsulate that sort of idea of how to be a great dad without sacrificing a great career, then that's a sense of a feeling that my coachees have. The men that I work with, the dads that I work with, that's how they kind of bundle it up. They have this concept of being a great dad, but also being great at work. And often, in a coaching conversation, we're looking to explore it in much greater detail than this kind of binary nature of work and career. I think sometimes, when we think about work-life balance or work-life integration, it's 2 sides of a scale, and I think it's too simplistic in many ways. And so this idea of being a great dad is actually for men generally, it's quite loaded in many ways. I think it's loaded in terms of societal expectations about what being a great man is, what being a great dad is, what sort of positive masculinity looks like, what kind of role models do we grow up with, what role models do we have around us for fatherhood. So it's really a sense of, I think in many ways, about being authentically yourself, but also being aware of maybe some of the challenges that certainly occur in heterosexual relationships, where when children come along, that I see it quite a lot in terms of relationships maybe slipping unintentionally, without necessarily much thought, into what we might describe as gendered roles. So it's about, I think, being a great dad is in many ways about making it work for your family and being authentically you. And sort of generational shift I think we're seeing is that men seeing the opportunity, certainly post-COVID in many ways, new dads in the last kind of 2-3 years starting to see it, opportunity to be more involved in their children's lives, more actively involved on a day-to-day basis. And that sense in many ways of wanting and feeling like they can have it all in a way that perhaps for a generation or more, that we've associated that sense of having it all more likely, much more with women and their aspirations at work and at home.
Yeah, and I love that sort of making it work for you and for others. And I remember when I was a dad, or still am a dad, but when my children were younger. I mean, they're young women now, so although I'm still a dad, it feels like they've flown the nest and all those. But yeah, when they were younger, I wanted to know. I wanted to be a great dad, and I hope I have been. But one of the questions when they were sort of 5 and 7, I asked them is, what could dad do better? And that was a big question, a bigger question than I thought. And what came back was, just spend more time with us, Dad. Which was quite a shock, because I thought I was spending time with them, but not in a way that they wanted. Yeah. And then I guess the other part of others is your partner. I have my wife. Yeah. So spending time with her and getting those things all in balance. So time for me, time to spend with my partner, time to spend with the children, and as a family as well, as a unit. So I get that. I guess it's like stakeholder management.
Yes, I think when you break it down like that, I think it is important that you understand the whole picture. I think often when I work with men, that they're quite focused on their own sort of personal direction, and from a relatively young age. I mean, we still have challenges in terms of, I think, how how we raise boys, how we sort of set men up for success and women up for success, and what we expect of them.
Mm.
And so men can be quite inward focused and quite inward looking. You see it sometimes in coaching conversations, is they can be quite focused on, mental health challenges and making sure they get the exercise they need, which is really, really important. I think it's, something that men are getting much more aware of, looking after themselves, this sense of putting on their oxygen mask first. But sometimes I need to ask the question and get men generally to think about this question of, is it right and fair to the people around me if I'm following this path? If I've got the classic one being, really time consuming hobbies. You don't need to spend
Mm.
too much time on Mumsnet to see men who have long sessions on the golf course for their mental health, or cycling, or, those
Mm.
tend to be the two sort of classic ones. And it's thinking about it in balance and thinking, okay, what do I need? And what do all these other elements, these stakeholders, as you say, I think it's a perfect example of describing it as stakeholders. They're clients sometimes as well.
Yeah,
Sometimes we
yeah.
talk about, I've been on sort of live events where, certainly from lawyers' perspective, that actually your family is another client, and actually your client, in managing your client relationships and keeping that in balance, and being quite intentional about what you do, is a really good way of bringing everyone along in the journey, and hopefully making life a success, whatever version of success that looks like for your family unit.
Yeah, and I think making it a success for everybody, is say that family unit. And like any good stakeholder analysis, you understand what those stakeholders' expectations, wants, and needs are, and finding a balance that works for you and for them. So yeah,
Yeah.
some nice ideas there. So we talked about you keep stating men, and without stating the obvious, I guess, are we assuming that dads are men?
Well, there's a question. Um, it might be, I mean, in the majority of cases,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, I mean, in the majority of cases, clearly we have individuals who identify, differently from their birth sex and that kind of thing. So I guess it's shorthand. Yeah, I suppose using men as a shorthand. Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting because about 80% of men will become dads at some stage during their lives. So it's a vast majority of men will experience that. But yeah, and I think it's an interesting conversation, because I think within parents who are soloing and sole care of their children, they are taking on, in some ways, both kind of traditional sort of
Mm.
female roles, mum roles, and dad roles at the same time, and blending those because they are the sole parent. And so I think in many ways it can be quite blended. And I think from the outside, if people to look at sort of my relationship, and it's certainly something that people sort of talk about, especially when you have young children and when you're a stay-at-home dad, is that you're doing a mum role. So actually, there's quite a
Mm.
lot of kind of interesting sort of narrative about how we look at parenting roles. And actually, I think in many ways, the role of mum in those kind of, if we're going to go traditional binary, the role of mum and dad is much more blended and much closer. To modern day life is much more complicated than certainly a generation ago. But
Yeah, and I guess we just listening to you there, we sort of stereotype: mum does this, dad does this.
mm,
And listening to you there, that's not, well, it's certainly not always the case. And I guess as a dad, as a mum, and as children, they see those sort of stereotype roles being reinforced. And
yeah,
I wonder whether organizations also see it as binary as that, and therefore policies or approaches then lean into that binary mindset.
yeah. And there is an assumption in organizations who don't have equalized parental leave, and we'll come back to that in a second,
Yeah.
is that men don't necessarily want to take leave, and there's no demand, there's no desire to do it. And so you frequently see organizations who have, very good enhanced maternity leave, and they maybe have statutory or maybe a couple of weeks of paid paternity leave. And And that can be quite problematic, certainly in single sex relationships, single gender relationships, where you come across women who are having to take paternity leave because actually there is no other mechanism. They're it gets clumsy when you talk about primary and secondary carers, but
Yeah.
there's no kind of mechanism for recognizing single gender relationships, and that becomes quite problematic. Organizations where they have increased or standardized sort of parental leave. So the classic, the top end benchmark tends to be about 6 months of fully paid leave, regardless of how you become a parent. What those organizations find is that where it's culturally embedded and it's not just a kind of tick box exercise, we've given this great policy, but our men don't take it sort of thing.
Mm.
But when we have equalized leave, then what we find is that in a majority of cases that men will take that leave. They will take the opportunity to be more closely associated, more closely sort of building relationships with their children, hopefully taking sole charge of their children, because I think that's one of the key aspects of building an understanding and building kind of parenting skills is actually for men to look after their children on their own, which is something that I both have the privilege and also the challenge of doing a couple of times with both my children.
Great.
And then one thing I'd say about that is, in terms of project management skills, you only forget to pack the nappy bag incorrectly or forget to put reload
Yeah.
the nappy bag.
Yeah.
You only forget that once because you just make sure it happens again. And so men taking sole charge of their children on a kind of regular basis, even for a number of weeks, without having somebody else that they can delegate to, really, really build skills and connections with their children in particular.
And I think it also builds an understanding of how challenging being a mum, if I may use that term, is, which is a full-time role, and if that individual, that mum, is in work as well, that becomes two jobs within the time that they've got.
Yeah, I think there's these two concepts that often talk about. There's a concept of second shift and there's a concept of mental load. And the second shift is a concept that came out of sociology in the early 1980s in America. And this idea of a first shift taking place in the workplace and a second shift is what you do when you come home. It tends to be quite visible labor. So it tends to be so cooking, cleaning, very obvious things that need to take place, taking the bins out, gardening, all these things would come under the second shift concept. But the perhaps the most interesting one is actually on the mental load, and that's the unseen labor, the knowledge, the understanding, the things that we hold in our heads, that I find myself in quite an interesting position because I've experienced it firsthand myself, and in this kind of non-traditional family role that we set up originally, Lisa and I, is that I understand more about that mental load thing. It's kind of that classic question. It's like, do you know who your child's doctor is? Do you know their shoe size? Things like that. That actually, if you ask men, it's quite in a big setting. It's like actually, you'll find that mums will know that often, not all the time, obviously not exclusively, and dads might not know. But oh, actually, I don't know that, or I don't, there's certain things that, and certain bits of knowledge, or, when do certain things need to happen? And often that hidden labor, that mental load is being disproportionately held by women in heterosexual relationships.
That's really interesting because I was just, as I said I would at the beginning of this podcast, sort of reflect on my role as a dad when my children were younger. And I'd like to think I helped on the second shift. But now you're talking about that, I took on very little of the mental load. And that must be, it is very tiring, I'm sure, for those who do take that on.
It is. And I think for any men sort of listening, well, anyone listening really, is to think about if you've got children who are in primary school, which is when this usually sort of takes place, is who is in the WhatsApp group, who is in the class WhatsApp group. Now, sometimes these class WhatsApp groups are positioned as mums groups. Now, they absolutely shouldn't be, because you're starting from a point that's quite challenging. But I'm in the WhatsApp class WhatsApp group, and so is Lisa. But that's quite unusual. There's a solo dad who's in there, and there's maybe one other dad. But the majority of those conversations, those mental load, those admin things around, PE days changed. Has everyone seen the Harvest Festival information? These sharing of knowledge around around sort of primary age children is being done predominantly by women in those relationships, heterosexual relationships. The men just aren't present in those spaces, and they need to be, and they ought to be, because what we have seen post COVID, and I've certainly seen it on a personal level, a lot more men doing pickups and drop offs, as we see flexible working being much more
Yeah.
flexible and remote working being much more common, but they're not engaging. So they're doing that sort of engaging, that time, precious time with your children, walking them to school. But actually, they completing the circle is about understanding, what needed to be in the bag this morning, because you're in the right spaces. And it can't just be women's spaces. There need to be men, and dads need to be within those spaces. If you want true equality and you want to be truly connected and to be truly, and have equality at home, you do need to be in those spaces that sometimes might feel a little bit uncomfortable to be there.
Yeah. So what I'm picking up in is to be a great dad is to understand what for you and for those around you, those takes what being a great dad means, but also with your partner sharing that emotional load and being in that space to communicate and understand the other elements beyond just that second shift.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think traditional roles can provide great certainty in relationships. And actually,
Yeah.
it work, for a significant minority, it works really, really well. But with increasing numbers of dual income relationships, certainly, certainly women in heterosexual relationships out earning their partners. I think there's American research, about 30% of all marriages, women are earning more than men, which is a lot higher than I thought it might be.
Mm.
And that's increased over the last 20 years or so. I think it's Pew Institute research. And so you're seeing these dynamics, actually, the dynamics in terms of that kind of breadwinning and caring responsibilities are shifting. But unless that second shift in mental load shifts as well, then actually you've got women in the workplace who are putting in the hours at work, and also the hours at home, and also the hours up here, thinking
Yeah.
about what's going on and organizing and being the project manager of the house. I think that's one part of being a great dad, as you say, is not only doing it, but the first step is being aware of it, and being aware of just how much stuff goes on,
Yeah.
and then taking control of some of those elements and divvying them up. So owning them, having ownership of things. So quick example, I don't do any of the clothes shopping for the children. So that's not my job. Lisa does all the clothes shopping for the children. She knows exactly the sizes. That's her job, responsible for that. I do everything food related. I do everything in terms of paying bills, in terms of making sure the kids have got the right stuff for school on the right day, and the piano book goes in on a Monday, and make sure that's in, and all these kind of things. I own all of those bits and pieces, and we divvy it up so that, and that's, I think, it's a really important part of that equality piece, is actually for men, is to own elements of it and not just be told what to do. It's like,
Yeah.
your job is to do this, own it, work out how you're going to do it. There's an element of allowing men to do that,
Yeah.
which is a whole
Well,
complicated on its own.
well, let's come on to that, because I certainly, when my children were at primary school, was told what I needed to do, which in a way is supporting the second shift, but not that taking on that mental load, because it's quite transactionary. And it's not that I didn't want to. So how did you get to a point with your wife, Lisa, where it sounds like you, using your terms, you divvied that up really well, the mental load and the second shift? How did that help dads understand how you achieved that?
Yeah. So I think it goes back to, I guess, in many ways, intentionally designing how we were going to live our lives. We knew so Freya is 13 now. And so going back to 2010, I had 2 weeks of statutory leave. Lisa has 6 months of fully paid leave. And when that leave ended, we didn't want to use nursery heavily to start with, and we wanted to kind of balance it, but we didn't have any grandparents around who could help out, which is kind of the classic sort of scenario. So one of us had to do something differently. And I was a management consultant at the time. I could work flexibly. Lisa was earning more. The gender pay gap in our house has gone from large to ridiculous in our home. But we intentionally designed, and so the financial side of things really, really mattered, but we intentionally designed a lifestyle that meant that I prioritize looking after the children as a first and foremost part of that. And so had to be quite intentional about
Yeah.
how we would do things. And then we have regular conversations. We check in on things. We use we use shared diaries. We check. I think we probably, from my experience of working with newish dads, I work in the parental transition field, and I don't think enough couples are having enough kind of boring conversations about who does what and when and how do we make this work.
Mm.
And part of it comes out of this differential between leave, is that when men have limited access to limited numbers of weeks of leave, and their female partners in heterosexual relationships are getting 6 months leave,
Yeah.
then the way that we do things in our family is often set by the way the mum does things and wants to do things. So she becomes the default lead, the lead carer, the lead everything. And actually, for Lisa and I, that didn't really happen, because after 6 months, I was the lead. And so we flipped it around. And then I set my own sort of expectations and my own way of doing things. And it can be quite challenging for men who haven't yet built the skills and the connections and seen the day-to-day operation of, okay, so we need to have the right clothes, we need to make sure the washing's done in the right way, running washing loads, because I know the 4 washing loads we do in our house because I've done it over and over again, and I did it from quite a young age. But if you haven't got the experience, and this is one of the challenges that men sometimes have, is that they don't necessarily have the experience, and then it can be quite challenging for their female partner to maybe let them make mistakes. There's a concept called maternal gatekeeping, which is this idea. It's partly driven by psychological changes when women become mothers, and actually it's a protective instinct largely, but also it's a sense of doing it in the right way. And just to wrap this a little bit up, because I appreciate I can talk for this forever, there's also, we can never underestimate the social stigma of getting things wrong. So men are let off mistakes in terms of clothing choices, perhaps, of not sending the child in with the right stuff. Oh, it's okay, it's only a dad, what does he know, kind of thing.
Mm.
Women face a lot more social stigma in terms of getting things wrong, of not having the packed lunch done, of being seen as a bad mum, whereas the same mistakes made by men are kind of dismissed as, that's just hey, it's just a dad, he's doing his best, kind of thing. It's laughed off, and it's not helpful on either side. And as a result, that possibly we have women who feel like they need to tell their husband exactly how to do things, because they can't make a mistake, because actually the social stigma that comes with that, and the challenge that comes with getting it wrong is quite demoralizing from a sense of being a good mum, to use the alternative. Men can get away with a lot more slackness in many ways, I think. Is part of it.
I find that fascinating in what you just outlined there, because it sort of, not only are we challenged by the sort of gender stereotypes, your mum, I'm dad, therefore we fit into those boxes. You then put that onto organizational policies where, going back to what you said, you get two weeks. Lisa got 6 months. So she's given time and sort of feels like she should own that and become the mother because she's got time at home, not having to go to work where you have to. And then also dad doesn't get that experience. Not only does he not know how to use the washing machine, probably doesn't know where it is. And then mum choosing and doing things, there's a pressure on mum to get stuff right. And dad just sits in the background.
Yeah. Being told
what to do.
On
the second shift.
Having, that kind of classic sort of, mum's away for the weekend, but she's prepared food for everyone for the weekend. It's like, don't do it.
Yeah. Instructions everywhere.
Yeah. Men need to, new dads need to learn the skills, and they need to have the space to make the mistakes. And the challenge is because in a lot of relationships, women have a head start of 6 months. And what's really, really interesting is that in single gender relationships, these kind of dynamics at home don't really come up in the same way. So there's a brilliant book called The Equal Parent by Paul Morgan Bentley, who I've recorded and done an event with and met him before. And he and his husband, they the way they do things isn't through this gendered filter. And this is what you find
Mm.
is that the domestic equality is actually much easier to achieve because you don't have dad jobs and mum jobs. You just have jobs that are done,
Jobs.
and it
Yeah.
just happens to be two men who are doing them. And so it tends to be much more skill based, or time based, or desire based. And there's a negotiation there, but it's not through the filter of gender.
Yeah.
There are challenges, certainly within how we perceive in the workplace in terms of single gender relationships, but domestically, from the conversations I've had, it's much easier to kind of negotiate within the relationship because we haven't got this sense of, and we haven't potentially, we haven't got this kind of gender norms from the outside as well, whether that's,
Yeah.
well-meaning mother-in-laws or parents or what we see around us in society. So it, it's a that whole gender equality piece at home, I think, is fascinating. But I think it's also important to understand sort of where it comes from. Often it comes from a place of caring and a place of trying to get things right and not making mistakes. And it comes from a good place. It's just good to
Yeah.
understand
And,
how
and,
it's
and may
there.
I talk into that good place? Because
Mm,
I think it would be fair to say most, if not all, dads, partners want to do a great job.
mm,
Um, but they're in this sort of space where I'm going to use the term not allowed to,
mm.
because mum, the mother, wants to get it right and not to make mistakes. So when you're coaching dads, do you see that sort of? I'm going to use the term that shows up. I'm useless. I'm trying my hardest, but I can't seem to contribute or can't seem to fill that gap and find the balance that you and your wife have found so brilliantly. So does that come up as a challenge for dads?
So it's interesting in terms of who I coach. So actually, I think that organizations are missing a trick in that my experience of coaching tends to be that I coach men who have already engaged in extended periods of leave. They're taking extended
Okay.
shared parental leave, or they've got ring fenced parental leave that they can access. So they've already made decisions, or they've already got some time and space to engage in the topic. I
Yeah.
don't get to work with the men who only have 2 weeks leave, who are taking on very traditional roles, or their
Mm,
relationship is very
mm,
traditional roles,
mm,
and perhaps are actually struggling more. And I think it's something that
mm.
organizations miss, is actually the people we really need to support are the men who are going to become dads, and help them to process and understand what it looks like after the baby's born. A lot of NCT, the classic thing, challenge with NCT and also with doctors kind of surgery groups, is it's up until birth. It's like, well, off you go kind of thing. But actually, we need
Mm.
to think more broadly around that. So and men who are being pulled in these two different directions. I want to be a great dad, but actually, at the moment, depending on certainly in the early days, obviously there's paid maternity, but they can see it kind of running out. Does my partner want to go back to work? I've got to work first and foremost. I need to provide because that's what our setup is. And actually, they struggle a little bit. So the men I actually coach are a little bit more. They're further down that journey. So they've got a much better understanding, which makes it
Yeah.
relatively easy to do. But it's in terms of, I'm trying to think of this particular individual, it's sometimes you're unpicking. So I work with men, often I work with men whose children are 4 or 5 years old. So we've got out of that kind of survival phase, and we're coming up and we're thinking, often men are thinking about legacy, they're thinking about connection, they're thinking about, okay, well, second best time, best time to start was then, second best time to start thinking about this is now. How do I unpick, and actually, how do I get involved? And so it's changing. It's starting to kind of have conversations about who owns what they're doing. And it
Mm.
can be quite difficult because although perhaps they've got a female partner who is struggling with the mental load and the second shift and their career, but certainly on the mental load side of things, they're so used to doing it, and it's so used to that relationship dynamic, is to have those conversations can be quite challenging for men to do, because they're starting to unpick at the fabric of the kind of the tacit, and often it is tacit, it's not kind of explicitly kind of constructed, that tacit agreement about how we do things.
Yeah.
And for a man who wants to be more involved and being
Yeah.
more, and also you can't take away the sense that being more actively involved in their children's lives may have a knock-on effect of how they're perceived at work. and they may fear that, okay, well, I want to be involved, but if I'm asking for something, if I want to go to 4 days a week, what does that mean for my longer term prospects? Actually, if we've as a in a relationship, if we've built our future kind of financial prosperity on, I do this, I work these out, I do this type of job, and then I'll get promoted to this level, and then we can buy that bigger house. Starting to have a conversation to unpick that can be quite challenging for them. And so being authentic, going back to that bit around, what a great dad is, being authentic and having the conversation first with yourself about what you really want, then at least allows you to kind of create a kind of certainty in your own mind about, okay, well, how do I have the next conversation? The
Yeah.
conversation at work potentially, or the conversation at home within my
Yeah.
relationship.
And I'm picking two bits up here, in if I may. I'm going to go
Mm.
to the first bit I heard, which was, if I heard you right, you start coaching dads when their children are about 5 years old. Did I hear that right?
Well, that's one part. So my private clients tend to be men who are whose children are about sort of 4 or 5 years old. So I have two types of clients. I have a few private clients who are interested in kind of legacy, and they've sort of seen my work. I don't sort of actively seek out sort of private
Yeah.
clients particularly. And so they're in a very different place to the men who are coming to me through corporate leads, corporate organizations for whom they are providing coaching as part of a parental transition program,
Okay.
a
Okay.
return to work. So there's two different types of men. Actually, there's men who are taking leave, and therefore they're much more connected with the opportunities and also the practicalities of sharing the caring and the breadwinning responsibilities.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you're working with men whose children are that bit older, and so some of those norms within the relationship have been established for a longer period of time.
And I guess that's what I was coming back to, is helping men to establish those norms, to find that relationship with their partner that works to share that, not only the second shift, but the mental load. And I guess that has to happen right at the beginning of fatherhood, when the child is born. Because I remember when I had my first daughter, in the first 6 months, I said to my wife, I'm not sure I can go on. So we found a way of
Yeah.
managing that. And the relationship built from those sort of, as you say, setting those norms
Mm.
from those early months of fatherhood. Um,
Yeah. I think it's hard. It's the best time is in those early days.
yeah,
And I think the best time is actually engaging with men who have only taken a limited amount of leave, because they're probably the ones who are struggling emotionally with that sense of balance. Men who
yeah,
have already made the decision to take 6 months off, and are thinking, okay, I need to I'm going to work 4 days a week, that's what I'm going to do. Can you help me to work out how I manage this at work? Because
yeah,
not many other guys do it.
yeah,
How am I going to do this? How am I going to be perceived? What am I, we work on their strengths and things like that. So although fatherhood is kind of a journey that a lot of men sort of progress through, then the milestones can be different, and they come very quickly in those early days. And anything you can do to intentionally have conversations within relationships and within those stakeholders at work as well,
yeah.
as to kind of, what your expectations are. And I think it's easy to assume, a dad, new dad in a workplace, it's easy to assume there aren't other dads in the workplace who feel the same way and are actually doing it, or maybe we haven't quite noticed how they're balancing things, or are worried about the same kind of challenges.
So the other point I want to come back to is around parental leave.
Mm.
And you mentioned going to, for men who want to go down to, or dads want to go down to, a 4 day week. And we mustn't forget the title of this podcast, which is about being a great dad, but at the same time developing a great career.
Mm.
Do you find men come to you and say, look, I can't go to a 4 day week because it's going to impact my career, or the stigma that I'm failing, that I can't keep up with managing a family and managing a career? Do you have men that come to that?
A little bit, yes. It's kind of all, when you think about, okay, what design, think about what does your ideal week look like? And actually, when you get back into, okay, in the perfect week, I'd be at home on these days, and I do that because actually partner has, she has, her hobby is on a Wednesday night, so I want to be working from home on a Wednesday so I can pick up all those aspects. And I'd really, and it'd be great if I could work from, if I could work 4 days a week. The first bit of the conversation, the first barrier tends to be more about, but we can't afford to do that.
Mm,
So, and it's that case of, I think, that sense of saying, okay, how much money do we have now, and what can we do with it? Rather than, and actually a better way of looking at it sometimes going back to kind of first principles, what do we want to achieve from our life and how much money do we need to earn to achieve that? And when you flip it round, actually what you often find is that you don't often, individuals find that they don't need to earn, or the relationship doesn't need to earn as much as they thought they did, because
mm,
we spend the money we have. And if you have lots of money, maybe you buy a new bigger house. But actually,
sure.
if you started off from first principles, actually what you really want to do is to be better connected with your children. And
Yeah.
maybe, and
So
that means working 4 days a week and having the same size house, whatever. Those kind of, it's that kind of interplay. And so often it's about kind of, what do you really want to achieve from it? And
yeah.
sometimes you'll find that men often are, I sometimes work with men who are like, they'll come to me in our first engagement. It's like, well, when I go back, I'm going to be 4 days a week. And there's a lady called Dr. Jasmine Kelland at the University of Plymouth, and she describes some groups of men as cavalier carers. They don't really care about what other people think. 4 days a week is what they want to do. It's what's good for their relationship. And if their career suffers a bit or in proportion to what it might have done, that's fine, because
Mm,
this is what we've decided to do it. She also called them something else, but it's not podcast friendly. But
okay.
it's something to do with fathers. But she called cavalier carers. But it's men who internally feel like it's something that's important to do. But you can't really build policy around cavalier carers, because they're already like, yeah, being a great dad, it means, for me, means 4 days a week.
Yeah.
But you need to, there's a whole other group of men who aren't perhaps brave enough, in inverted commas, to do that, or the barriers that are around them are too great. So um, there is certainly a desire, and I certainly see it as very much a difference between coaching new dads pre-pandemic and since COVID, because of how the opportunities to work in different ways, and men's eyes have been opened in terms of how we can blend and integrate these different aspects, work and family life,
Yeah.
quite simple terms.
So what I'm hearing is dads having a reflection and saying, what is it that I really want? And then from that, can I afford to do that? Both time and obviously money as well.
Yeah,
And that then crafts the plan ahead and the way in which they operate and find that work-life balance with the family and other things.
that's
And we're calling
that's
them
the
cavalier dads, right?
cavalier carers. Yeah, sometimes they're
Carers,
cavalier
sorry, cavalier
carers.
carers.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
But I think that's the place you want to get to, is what do I want first? And then how do I get there? What I tend to find, what you tend to find generally with men is like, this is where I am at the moment. I can't possibly do anything differently because of X, Y, and Z. And some of that might be finances, but often that's not a conversation they've explicitly had with their partner. Actually, that's sometimes the big thing, is that, you ask the question, how much have you talked about that with your wife? So not that much. And sometimes you get them where they absolutely have. Yeah, we've planned it out, we've worked out, we have these really great conversations, we understand our direction as a couple and what our trade-offs are. But more often than not, it's something that's up here that they're worried about, and it's about helping them find a way of expressing it and start those conversations.
I'd like to change the sort of focus of the conversation, if I may, Ian, and focus on the organizational element.
Mm.
And what I'm picking up is that organizations should be considering the balance that they have with the mother and the father, maternity leave, paternity leave, but also the value that having that balance and equality for all parties within the organization, the value that that gives not just to the individual but to the organization as well. So can you talk into your own
Mm.
experience and the value that you see of having, those more flexible and agile approaches to fatherhood and motherhood?
Yeah, it's an entire podcast all on its own, I think. In terms of that, I think I'll start with a kind of personal story. When I first started working in this field, I did a present. I was invited to do a presentation at my wife's old business, and the lady who got me in was, I think she's around about 30 years old, didn't have children. And she said to me, she said, when I first met Lisa, that's my wife Lisa, she said, when I first met Lisa, I didn't think Lisa had children because I didn't think a mum could do this job. And she said, I realized how damaging that was for my prospects as a young woman, prospects of everyone around me. If I thought that, then everyone probably thought that. And so this sense of discounting sort of motherhood, discounting sort of the female experience, and this assumption that um, women will have children and they will want to take leave and they will want to work in a different way. Men won't. And it's that kind of sense that actually in organizations where there are opportunities to take enhanced leave, men do take it, subject to a bit of line management pressure, and touch on that in a minute. Um, Men do take leave, and so you change the culture of an organization so that when you're thinking about, okay, well, who's the best prospect for promotion, or who's the best kind of candidate, and you have two equally qualified candidates. If you can't tell which one of them is going to want to take leave, which one of them is going to want to work 4 days a week, you can't implicitly or otherwise kind of discriminate against the female candidate in many cases, because you can't make those assumptions. So one of the big things about supporting new dads at work and why it's a route to gender equality is you start to change the culture of how you see women in the workplace as opposed to how you see men in the workplace. If you can break those assumptions, then you do enormous, you create a very different way of working. I think you create a very different way of what success looks like. You create environments where actually, as long as the job's done, then how and when you do it is perhaps less of an issue, because you have large numbers of men potentially who have gained enormous kind of skill, across enormous kind of transferable skills in terms of hands-on parenting, but also they've taken leave, they looked after the children on their own, they understand a female kind of gender perspective in a way they wouldn't otherwise know, and they take that into their day to day. And so you build much more much more sort of balanced environments, much more equal, gender, those kind of gendered norms that kind of get broken up, because actually the whole organization knows, young man going to take leave, okay, fine, it's a resource planning issue rather than a more sort of tightly controlled kind of sense of, well, he doesn't take leave because he's a man, therefore we don't need to worry about him. Oh, these women all do, and we start discounting their experience in the same way that Lisa's colleague sort of assumed that was the case. So that big thing is around the culture of the organisation.
And I guess the impact on sort of the wider societal element is that we start to understand the jobs and the demands of the mother and the father in a more balanced way, because
Yeah,
fathers are doing more of that sort of emotional load, as you talked about.
yeah, we start to move towards seeing, instead of seeing it as mothers and fathers, we start to see them as parents generally.
Yeah,
And I think and it's an interesting conversation, because I think in the best will in the world, we want to treat parents as parents. I think that's the ideal situation, is that we have the gender neutral parents, and it's a parenting experience rather than a
yeah.
fatherhood, motherhood experience.
Mm.
But our starting point isn't at that position yet. So I'm a big advocate of tailored programs for mums and tailored programs for dads, because actually the starting point, the societal expectations around those individuals, the assumptions that we make, the practicalities around who takes leave are constraints and have to be kind of treated in different ways, because actually the dynamics are very different. The more we get in terms of extended leave and opportunities for dads to be more actively involved in their children's lives, then the more we get towards that sense of parenting rather than motherhood or fatherhood. I think that's the real big win. And I think it's one of the really big wins, that societal sort of overflow from giving extended leave. But one of the things really important within organizations is to make sure the line managers move with those policy decisions, because often it's the pressure and the comments and the suggestions, that gatekeeping sense, that actually it's for a man considering taking leave. He may be entitled to really great leave, but if his boss takes him to one side and said, yeah, I don't want you to take that leave because, it's going to affect me, it's going to affect the team, it's going to affect your prospects, that becomes a really difficult conversation. So you can have a brilliant culture corporately, but you can have pockets of line management which are potential blockers, and making sure the line managers understand kind of the policy and hearts and minds at that point, because that can be that's the really difficult piece. And it's really striking that my coaching conversations initially, it's like, well, tell me about work, tell me about your department, and men every single time will say, my boss is brilliant, he really gets it, she really gets it, she's been really supportive of my leave. It's front and center of what men say when they, as part of the conversation about why they're taking leave and how they're looking to develop their career post leave and when they come back, and that side of things.
So it sounds like there's some brilliant areas of culture that's happening, but it's still work in progress to get to that understanding of parenting and the importance of parents taking leave to spend with their families.
And absolutely. And it's about understanding that men do want to take leave. And if you give them the opportunity and you create the right framework around leave for men, that men will take it when they can afford to. And that well-paid leave, they will take it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Ian, sadly, time's got the better of us. As you said, I'm sure we could create several podcasts. But for this one, time's got the better of us. I hope our listeners, I'm sure they have taken huge amounts of value from that, especially dads that are listening. And being a father myself, I totally get all of those points that you've mentioned and really highlighted, I guess, the journey that I've been on. Before I let you go, I always ask my guests one final question. And at Coaching Focus, we have a very simple purpose, which is coaching for a better tomorrow. So from your perspective, what does coaching for a better tomorrow mean? I
think for me, within my field, I think that the really big opportunity is within government legislation, is equalising the amount of leave that's on the statute book. So for men, it would be 6 weeks of paid paternity leave that men could access regardless of whether they're self-employed or in organisations. If you set that that floor in the right place, then organisations will enhance on top of it. You see it in Switzerland as well. When the minimum comes up, it improves the opportunities. And when men have the opportunity to take leave, and when it's paid and they can afford to do it, they will take it, and that builds a better connections with their children and better connections within their relationships.
Great. And that creates a better tomorrow.
Absolutely.
So Ian, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. And as I say, I'm sure our listeners have taken a lot from our conversation. So thank you.
My pleasure, Trayton.